February 20, 2003. West Warwick, Rhode Island. The Station nightclub. 100 people lost their lives in less than 6 minutes when pyrotechnics ignited soundproofing foam during a concert by the band Great White. It was the fourth deadliest nightclub incident in American history. The flames were extinguished. The victims were laid to rest. Criminal cases were prosecuted. Families buried their loved ones and tried, impossibly, to move forward. But for investigators and survivors, something remained unfinished, a thread left dangling in the smoke-filled darkness. 20 years would pass before that thread was finally pulled. When it was, an arrest would shake the community all over again, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. The question that haunted Rhode Island for 2 decades was this: had everyone responsible truly been held accountable? The town of West Warwick sits in the heart of Rhode Island, a place of mill villages and working families, of tight-knit neighborhoods where generations grew up knowing each other's names. In the winter of 2003, snow still clung to the edges of parking lots, and the wind off Narragansett Bay carried the salt smell of the Atlantic. The Station nightclub sat on Cowassett Avenue, a single-story building with a flat roof and a facade that gave no hint of what lay inside. It was a venue where local bands played, where people came to dance and drink and forget, for a few hours, the weight of ordinary life. On that Thursday night, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Cars filled the gravel lot. Inside, the club was packed beyond capacity. Estimates would later put the crowd at nearly 500 people, though the building was approved for far fewer. The walls were lined with polyurethane foam, installed as soundproofing without the required permits, without flame retardant treatment, without anyone asking the questions that should have been asked. The stage was small, the ceiling low. The exits were few. Among those in attendance was a young woman named Jennifer, 27 years old, who worked as a dental assistant in Cranston. She had come with friends, excited to see Great White, a band she had followed since high school. She wore jeans and a black sweater. Her hair was pulled back. She had called her mother before leaving, told her not to wait up. There was a man named Stephen, 34, a construction worker from Warwick who had stopped by after his shift, still wearing his work boots. There was a couple, married 3 years, celebrating a birthday. There was a bartender who had worked at the station for 6 months, saving money for college. Their names, their faces, their small, ordinary plans for the weekend, all of it mattered. All of it would be erased in the span of a commercial break. At approximately 11:07 p.m., the band took the stage. The crowd pressed forward. The music started, loud and driving, the bass vibrating through the floorboards. Then, as part of the show, the tour manager triggered pyrotechnic gerbs, fountains of sparks that shot 15 feet into the air on either side of the stage. The crowd cheered. Some held up cameras. The sparks arced upward, beautiful and deadly, and touched the foam on the walls. The foam ignited instantly. Flames spread across the ceiling like liquid, faster than anyone watching could process. Later, fire investigators would describe the material as gasoline in solid form. Within 30 seconds, thick black smoke filled the club. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. People near the stage turned toward the exits. Those farther back didn't yet understand what was happening. The lights were still on. The music was still playing. Then someone screamed. The main entrance, a set of double doors near the front of the building, became a bottleneck. Bodies piled against bodies. People clawed and pushed and trampled. The smoke descended in a wall, blinding, suffocating. In the chaos, few knew there were other exits. A side door near the kitchen. A door near the stage that led to the band's dressing area. But in the darkness and confusion, most ran toward the way they had entered. It was instinct. It was also fatal. Outside, the first witnesses saw flames punching through the roof. A man stumbled from the entrance, his clothes on fire, screaming for help. Another collapsed on the gravel, gasping. Someone called emergency services. The first dispatch went out at 11:08 p.m. Within minutes, fire crews from West Warwick, and Coventry were racing toward Cowicett Avenue. The glow could be seen from a mile away. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was fully engulfed. The heat was so intense they couldn't approach the entrance. Bodies lay in the doorway, stacked 3 and 4 deep, some still moving, some already gone. Survivors wandered the parking lot in shock, their faces blackened, their hands burned. A triage area was set up on the pavement. Ambulances lined the street. Television crews began arriving. By midnight, the scene was chaos. Flashing lights, shouting voices, the crackle of radios, the smell of burning wood, and something worse, something no one wanted to name. Clear's throat. The search operation began before dawn. Investigators entered the charred remains of the building wearing protective gear, their headlamps cutting through the smoke-stained darkness. What they found inside defied description. Bodies were found in clusters near the exits, where people had fallen and been crushed or overcome by smoke. Others were found beneath tables, in corners, collapsed where they had tried to crawl toward air. The medical examiner's office in Providence was overwhelmed. Refrigerated trucks were brought in to serve as temporary storage. Families gathered at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Warwick, clutching photographs, waiting for word. The community response was immediate and staggering. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds to assist with search efforts, to bring food and water to emergency workers, to staff phone banks and organize blood drives. Local churches opened their doors. Counselors were dispatched to schools. The Rhode Island Convention Center was converted into a family assistance center. The state's governor declared a state of emergency. The media descended, local stations, national networks, reporters from as far as Europe and Asia. The story was everywhere. The images, flames pouring from the building, survivors running through the parking lot, played on loop. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, inconsistencies emerged. The first centered on the pyrotechnics. Who had authorized them? The band's tour manager, a man named Daniel, insisted he had received verbal permission from the club's owner to use the gerbs. The club's owner, 2 brothers named Jeffrey and Michael, denied ever giving such permission. Security footage from inside the club, recovered from a news cameraman who had been filming that night, showed the sparks igniting the foam. But who was responsible? Who had installed the foam? Who had approved it? Who had failed to inspect it? Deputies assigned to the case whispered quietly among themselves. There were too many points of failure, too many people who should have known better, too many corners cut in the name of profit or convenience or simple negligence. The building had been inspected by the town's fire marshal in the months before the incident, but no violations had been cited. The foam had been installed by the club's owners to address noise complaints from neighbors. The pyrotechnics were standard for rock concerts, used by touring bands across the country. But in this building, with this foam, with this many people, the combination was lethal. The physical evidence was methodical and damning. Fire investigators determined that the foam lining the walls and ceiling had no flame retardant properties. Samples were tested in laboratories. When exposed to flame, the material ignited in seconds and produced toxic smoke capable of incapacitating a person in under 2 minutes. The building's exits were inadequate. The front doors opened inward, making escape more difficult as bodies pressed against them. The side exits were unmarked and unfamiliar to most patrons. The building's occupancy permit listed a maximum capacity far below the number of people present that night. Witness statements painted a picture of chaos and confusion. Those who knew the layout of the building, the staff and regular patrons, had a better chance of survival. Those who had never been to the station before followed the crowd toward the main entrance and became trapped. Survivors described the smoke as instantaneous, the heat as unbearable. One woman said she was separated from her husband in the crush and never saw him again. Another said he crawled on his hands and knees, following the sound of someone's voice, and emerged through a side door he hadn't known existed. A bouncer stationed near the stage pulled people toward the band's exit, saving dozens of lives before he himself was overcome. The tour manager, Daniel, was arrested on February 26, 2003, just 6 days after the incident. He was charged with multiple counts related to involuntary manslaughter. He showed little emotion during his arraignment, his face pale, his hands cuffed in front of him. Those who observed him said he seemed stunned, unable to fully comprehend what had happened. The club's owners, Jeffrey and Michael, were arrested shortly thereafter, facing similar charges. Their attorney released a statement expressing condolences to the families, but offering no admission of wrongdoing. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued. Autopsies were completed. Victim identifications were finalized. Funerals were held across Rhode Island and beyond. The youngest person lost was 18. The oldest was 62. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and colleagues. Their absence left craters in the lives of those who loved them. But even as criminal proceedings moved forward, questions lingered. Had the fire marshal failed in his duty? Had the town's building department overlooked violations? What about the company that manufactured the foam? What about the band itself, whose management had hired the tour manager? Lawsuits began piling up. Civil cases against the club, the band, the town, the foam manufacturer, the pyrotechnics supplier. Families sought answers and accountability. They wanted someone to explain how this had been allowed to happen. By the end of 2003, the case against the tour manager and the club owners was advancing through the courts. But for many, it felt insufficient. Too many people had played a role. Too many systems had failed. The investigation, once urgent and all-consuming, began to slow. Media attention shifted. The news cycle moved on. The families were left to grieve in silence. Clear's throat. The years that followed were marked by quiet suffering. Jennifer's mother, a woman named Carol, relocated to Florida. She couldn't bear to stay in Rhode Island, couldn't drive past the corner where the station had stood. She sold her house and moved south to a place where no one knew her story, where she could walk into a grocery store without seeing sympathy in strangers' eyes. But the distance didn't help. At night, she dreamed of flames. She woke gasping, certain she smelled smoke. She kept Jennifer's bedroom exactly as it had been, her clothes still in the closet, her jewelry box on the dresser. Stephen's wife, a schoolteacher named Lisa, tried to rebuild her life. She returned to work 6 months after the incident. Her colleagues were kind but awkward, unsure what to say. She started seeing a therapist. She joined a support group for survivors and families, but the grief was relentless. She would be standing in her classroom, teaching fractions to 4th graders, and suddenly she would remember Stephen's laugh, the way he always smelled like sawdust and coffee, and she would have to excuse herself, lock herself in the bathroom and cry until her throat ached. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the unspoken tension of knowing something is wrong but being unable to name it, the years after the station fire were a lesson in endurance. Families fractured under the weight of shared trauma. Marriages dissolved. Parents blamed themselves for letting their children go out that night. Survivors struggled with guilt. Why had they lived when others had not? Some turned to substances to numb the pain. Others threw themselves into advocacy, determined that their loss would mean something, that it would prevent future tragedies. In 2006, the criminal cases concluded. The tour manager, Daniel, pleaded no contest to 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in custody, with all but 4 years suspended, followed by probation. The club owner, Jeffrey, accepted a plea deal and received a 10-year sentence with 3 years to serve. His brother, Michael, was not charged criminally but faced civil liability. The sentences felt inadequate to many families. How could 4 years in custody balance against 100 lives? But the legal system had spoken. The cases were closed. The civil lawsuits continued for years, eventually resulting in settlements totaling over $176 million, paid out by the club, the band, the town, the foam manufacturer, and others. The money was distributed among survivors and families. It couldn't bring anyone back, but it provided some measure of financial stability for those who had lost breadwinners, for those facing lifelong medical costs from burn injuries and smoke inhalation. In 2013, 10 years after the incident, a memorial park was dedicated at the site where the station had stood. The building itself had been demolished shortly after the incident, the lot cleared and left empty. The memorial featured a circular pathway with granite markers bearing the names of those who had been lost. Trees were planted. A stone monument was erected. Families gathered for the dedication ceremony, standing in the cold February wind, their faces etched with a decade of grief. But even as the community tried to heal, even as the memorials were built and the lawsuits settled, something gnawed at the edges of the story. Investigators who had worked the case, now retired or reassigned, occasionally revisited the files. They turned over details in their minds. They wondered if they had missed something. Those who had been there that night, who had survived, reported strange behaviors in the years that followed, nightmares that never faded, a hyper-awareness of exits in every building they entered, an inability to tolerate crowds or loud music. Some drew pictures of flames, compulsively, filling sketchbooks with images they couldn't shake. Children who had lost parents grew up with gaps in their understanding, piecing together their family history from fragments and whispered conversations. The psychological weight was immense and largely invisible. Support groups met in church basements. Therapists in Rhode Island developed specializations in trauma related to the incident. But for many, there was no help that could reach them. They carried their grief privately, locked away where it festered and grew. Marriages crumbled under the strain. A survivor who had lost his best friend drank himself into oblivion and was found deceased in his apartment 2 years later. A mother who had lost her daughter took her own life on the anniversary of the incident. The death toll, in that sense, never stopped rising. Clears throat. By 2020, 17 years had passed. The station fire had become history, taught in fire safety courses and referenced in building code regulations. Rhode Island had strengthened its fire safety laws in the wake of the tragedy, requiring sprinkler systems in nightclubs, limiting the use of flammable materials, mandating clearer exit signage. Other states followed suit. The incident had changed policy across the nation, but for those who had lived through it, the passage of time brought no comfort. Then in late 2022, something shifted. A cold case unit within the Rhode Island State Police, tasked with reviewing older files, began re-examining the evidence from the station fire. They were prompted by a tip, an anonymous letter sent to the department, suggesting that someone involved in the incident had not been fully investigated. The letter was vague, offering no names, no specific allegations, but it was enough to warrant a second look. Detectives pulled the original case files, boxes and boxes of reports, witness statements, photographs, and forensic analyses. They reviewed the security footage again, frame by frame. They re-interviewed survivors who were willing to speak. They consulted with fire safety experts and reviewed building records. What they found was a pattern of negligence that extended beyond the individuals who had already been prosecuted. The foam that lined the walls of the station had been purchased and installed by the club's owners. But the detectives discovered that a building inspector, a man named Raymond who had worked for the town of West Warwick in 2003, had visited the station multiple times in the months leading up to the incident. His job was to ensure the building met code. According to town records, he had signed off on inspections without noting the presence of the highly flammable foam. Either he had failed to notice it, or he had noticed and said nothing. Raymond had retired in 2010. He was 71 years old in 2022, living in a modest house in Cranston. When detectives approached him for an interview, he was cooperative but defensive. He insisted he had done his job properly. He said he didn't recall seeing foam on the walls during his inspections, but when pressed, he admitted that he hadn't always conducted thorough walkthroughs. Sometimes, he said, he had approved inspections based on paperwork alone, trusting that the club's owners were following regulations. Further investigation revealed that Raymond had received payments, small amounts, a few $100s here and there, from the club's owners in the years before the incident. The payments were documented in the club's financial records, labeled as consulting fees. Raymond claimed the payments were for advice on unrelated property matters, but the timing was suspicious. The payments coincided with the installation of the foam and with Raymond's inspections of the building. Clears throat. On March 14, 2023, 20 years and 3 weeks after the incident, Raymond was arrested at his home. He was charged with multiple counts of misconduct in office, reckless endangerment, and involuntary manslaughter. The arrest was conducted quietly without media fanfare, but word spread quickly through the community. Television crews set up outside Raymond's house. Reporters interviewed neighbors who expressed shock. One woman said, "He seemed like such a nice man. He helped me shovel my driveway last winter." The arrest reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Families who had lost loved ones in the incident released statements through their attorneys. One father, whose daughter had been among those lost, said, "For 20 years, we have carried the weight of knowing that negligence took our loved ones. To learn now that there was another person who failed in his duty, who looked the other way, is almost unbearable. But we are grateful that the truth is finally coming to light." Survivors reacted with a mixture of anger and vindication. A woman who had escaped through a side exit, her back scarred with burns, told reporters, "I've always felt like the full story wasn't told. I'm glad they didn't give up on finding the truth." Others expressed frustration that the arrest had taken so long. "Why did it take 20 years?" one man asked. "How many people had to live with this pain before someone decided to dig deeper?" The media coverage was extensive. National news outlets picked up the story. Documentaries that had been produced about the station fire were updated to include the new developments. Podcasters and true crime writers revisited the case. Public opinion was divided. Some believed Raymond deserved to be held accountable, that his failure to enforce building codes had directly contributed to the tragedy. Others felt he was being scapegoated, that he was an easy target for a system that had failed on multiple levels. Raymond's attorney released a statement. "My client is deeply saddened by the tragedy that occurred at the station nightclub. However, he did not cause the fire. He did not install the foam. He did not set off the pyrotechnics. He was a public servant doing his job to the best of his ability. We will vigorously defend against these charges." The case moved through the legal system slowly. Pretrial hearings were held throughout 2023. Evidence was presented. Witnesses were called. The prosecution argued that Raymond's failure to properly inspect the building and his acceptance of payments from the club's owners constituted criminal negligence. The defense argued that Raymond's actions, while perhaps not exemplary, did not rise to the level of criminal conduct. They pointed out that the club's owners had already been prosecuted and that Raymond was being unfairly targeted. In November 2023, the case went to trial. The courtroom was packed. Family members of those lost in the incident sat in the gallery, some holding photographs of their loved ones. Survivors attended, their presence a silent testament to the lives forever altered. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution called expert witnesses who testified about building codes and inspection procedures. They presented the financial records showing payments from the club to Raymond. They showed photographs of the foam-lined walls, arguing that any competent inspector should have noticed the violation. The defense called Raymond to the stand. He was elderly, his hands trembling slightly as he took the oath. He testified that he had conducted inspections to the best of his ability, that he had relied on the club's owners to be truthful about their compliance with codes. He admitted accepting the payments but insisted they were for unrelated consulting work. He became emotional at one point, saying, "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. If I had known that foam was dangerous, I would have said something. I would have shut the place down." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On December 8, 2023, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Raymond showed no visible reaction. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. In the gallery, some family members wept. Others sat in silence, their faces unreadable. Sentencing was scheduled for February 2024. Before the hearing, family members were given the opportunity to make victim impact statements. One by one, they stood and spoke. Jennifer's mother, Carol, now 73 and frail, read from a prepared statement. Her voice shook. "My daughter was 27 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She trusted that when she walked into that building, it was safe. Someone was supposed to make sure it was safe. That was your job." She looked directly at Raymond. "You failed, and because you failed, I will never see my daughter again." Stephen's wife, Lisa, spoke as well. She had remarried, but she still carried Stephen's memory. "I want you to understand," she said, "that this isn't just about one night. This is about every day since. Every morning I wake up and remember he's gone. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday. You didn't just take his life. You took our future together." Raymond was sentenced to 12 years in custody. Given his age and health, the sentence was effectively a life term. His attorney indicated they would appeal. As he was led from the courtroom, Raymond looked back at the gallery. His expression was difficult to read, regret, perhaps, or defiance, or simply exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around the families. One father who had lost his son said, "This doesn't bring him back. Nothing will. But it matters that the truth came out. It matters that someone was held accountable." The case closed in early 2024, more than 20 years after the incident that had sparked it. The Station nightclub fire remained one of the deadliest incidents of its kind in American history. The Memorial Park in West Warwick continued to draw visitors, families laying flowers, survivors standing in quiet reflection, strangers who had heard the story and felt compelled to pay their respects. Clears throat. The story of the Station fire is not just about what happened on one terrible night in February 2003. It is about the systems that failed, the people who looked the other way, the small decisions that compounded into catastrophe. It is about grief that does not fade, about families that never fully heal, about a community forever marked by loss. It is also about persistence. The investigators who refused to let the case rest, the families who demanded accountability, the survivors who carried their scars and their stories forward. Justice, when it finally came, was incomplete. It could not restore what was lost. It could not undo the suffering of those who remained. But it mattered. It said that negligence has consequences, that those who fail in their duties will be held to account, that the truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually surface. The 100 people who perished in the Station nightclub fire are remembered. Their names are etched in granite. Their stories are told and retold. They are not forgotten. And in that remembering, in that refusal to look away, there is a measure of justice that no courtroom can provide. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.